Hey everyone, this is Joe Crawl, president of the Society of St. Sebastian, and again, welcome to our weekly update, and again, welcome to Pro-Life University. Hope you've been enjoying these videos. Hopefully they've been informative to you. This week's topic, we're going to be talking about the Born Alive Infant Protection Acts that various states are trying to pass, and some states have been successful in passing. And we're also going to talk about some of the current events surrounding these particular bills and why they're needed, how these sorts of examples point to the need of it, and then obviously kind of get into some of the ethics of it as well. What are some of the deeper ethical questions that are involved with respect to this kind of legislation? Again, let's look at some of the current events, and again, we can point to several different factors here. We can point to the New York law, the Reproductive Health Act, where that was passed earlier this year. We can certainly look at Ralph Northam's comments about, if a baby is born alive when the woman wanted to have an abortion, and, well, we would just keep the baby comfortable sort of thing. We can look at the Center for Medical Progress's case out in California, and David Daleiden. In fact, that's a good place to start. This case is really showing many people about the real need to limit these harms that abortion has really unleashed. Last week we talked about the need for fetal disposition laws and how that particular case points to the need for fetal disposition laws. This week, this case points to the real need of Born Alive Infant Protection Acts. The simple fact was, an abortionist testified in that case, and he even admitted in court, on record, that in some cases these children had to be born alive, and then organs would be harvested from those living children. It's a horrifying thing, and I think most normal people would be appalled, and certainly every person who has a pro-life bone in their body would be appalled by hearing such a thing. Now this is on record. It seems that Planned Parenthood and the abortion industry is willing to have children be born alive in order to harvest their organs. Scary, scary stuff. And so, again, this sort of example, this most recent example, certainly points to the need to ensure that these children do receive protection. Furthermore, we can look at the New York state law, the Reproductive Health Act, for example. One of the big lobbying points that abortion advocates used to sit there and lobby that particular bill was that it was going to codify Roe. Well, let me tell you, as someone who studies pro-life public policy from an ethical perspective, I can certainly tell you that that law went well beyond Roe. There are provisions within that law that are very vague that seem to leave it open for infanticide. That's a problem. That's a huge problem, and something that should scare New Yorkers and really anyone in America, that New York is willing to take a step to allow infanticide. And I think in many respects, these states that have been passing Born Alive Infant Protection Acts are reacting to that sort of that sort of legislation that came out of New York. So again, these are some of the more prominent examples. And again, I think we're seeing states wanting to push it, certainly at the state level, because the House of Representatives has refused to bring it up for a vote. Every time it's brought up, it's basically denied. And this has been going on now for a while, and it's been denied over 80 times to be allowed to come up for a vote. So that being said, let's dive into some of the more nitty-gritty issues, if you will, regarding this sort of thing. Typically, one of the more big questions that most people will ask when it comes to this type of legislation is, why do we need it? Aren't babies already protected when they're born alive? And the question is it seems to be kind of a gray area, unfortunately. A lot of states, after Roe became law of the land, did pass various versions of the Born Alive Infant Protection Act. But it seems that many abortionists sort of found a loophole. And the loophole is basically this. They say that the baby who is born because of an attempted abortion or a botched abortion, they say that baby is not their patient. that it's the woman who is their patient. And so if the baby is not their patient, they have no legal duty to do any sort of procedure to help preserve the life of that child. And we realize this now in many respects. States like New York that are passing this, that are seemingly kind of allowing, if you will, for infanticide, it really kind of highlighted the need to really strengthen those sorts of laws. And so many states have been going around trying to do just that. One, we need to understand that there really is not just a legal duty, but a moral duty to help these young children that have been born in a very unfortunate circumstance. And this kind of gets to the idea that we do have a duty to protect others. And really this stems from the fact of what a human being is. If we kind of look at it philosophically, metaphysically, if you will, the human is a rational social creature. He is able to understand concepts. He's a social creature. He lives in society and so forth. And in many ways, we have an obligation to seek the good for others. You know, we don't want to sit there and do bad things to other people. We want to seek the good for others. And so we do have a duty, for example, to help others when they're in need. This is just basic common sense in many respects, but sometimes it has to be spelled out for people to really understand it. And we see this sort of element in law. So, for example, people get into a fender bender. And you certainly have an obligation to ensure that in that fender bender, no one got hurt, especially if you were the person that's at fault. You need to make sure that they're okay, that you exchange information such as insurance, driver's license information, all that kind of info. And again, the whole idea is based on the very premise, the very real premise, that you owe the other person help. Why? Because you have the obligation to seek their good. And in many ways, this is exactly what the Born Alive Infants Protection Act is trying to enshrine here in the law. That the doctors do actually have the duty to help these young children. Why? Well, one, they created the harm. Right? The abortion, you know, usually when there's an attempted abortion, the child is injured either by being born prematurely or being born injured and so forth. And so the doctor has a very real obligation to help that child, right? A very real moral obligation. Now, obviously, some of these abortionists are trying to skirt around the law, and they're not looking at it from so much a moral perspective as we're going to look at it from purely a legalistic perspective. So I think it's important for pro-lifers to go out there and understand that in many cases we're shining a light on this gray area, if you will, that in fact there is a duty to help these young children that have survived an abortion, and this doctor needs to do something. Again, you know, I mean, the simple fact is if someone's injured in an accident and the person who was at fault drives off, that person can be sued, he can go to jail, any number of consequences that person can face. I mean, that's just the reality of it. So it's a simple fact that if we can sit there and enshrine this principle in this particular sort of scenario, we certainly can enshrine it in this type of scenario as well. Well, let's talk a little bit about what the Born Alive Infant Protection Act really does. There's really kind of three things that it really does if it were to become enacted as a law in your state. So, for example, one, it establishes a patient-physician relationship between the abortionist and the child. That's number one. And obviously that's something very, very crucial. If there's a relationship, that kind of leads to number two, which is his duty to actually help preserve the life of this child. And we got to remember, you know, these abortionists, you know, typically they have degrees in medicine. They're doctors normally, and they have an advanced medical education. much more advanced than, say, obviously the normal person off the street. And so they would need to use that medical education for the good. In this particular case, it would be for the good of preserving the life of the child. The third element really kind of gets into the idea of consequence for failing to perform your duties. And again, I think this is important as well. You got to have a law that has teeth. You got to have a law that has consequences. And in this particular case, obviously depending on the state, the abortionist can face severe consequences for failing to perform his legal duty. And I don't want to just say it's a legal duty because, obviously in many cases what we see here is a moral principle that's being enshrined within the civil law. And I think that's really important to understand here, that in many ways we've already enshrined this law or this principle in law. And I just gave you an example, especially when it comes to car accidents. But the simple fact is here's another example where it needs to be enshrined. And I think it's important with respect to this. We live in a day and age where it's mighty dangerous, and we're seeing abortion advocacy organizations start to move away from this idea of the so-called right to abortion to this so-called right to a dead baby. And that should be frightening. In many ways, that's what Ralph Northam's comments earlier this year kind of point to. That ought to be frightening. Not to mention the New York law. Again, it's pointing to this idea that there's somehow some right to a dead baby. And again, as I said, that goes beyond Roe. Roe did not talk about a right to a dead baby. And what these people are advocating is something that's well beyond Roe. The simple fact is there is a moral duty. You have a living being present who has been harmed by an abortion. The abortionist is the one that caused the harm, and so the abortionist therefore has a duty to help protect that young one and help preserve their life to the best of their ability. Failure to do that can result in serious consequences. And again, that's kind of the need why, well, not kind of, but really the need, the big need why states ought to pass Born Alive Infant Protection Acts. Well, folks, I hope you enjoyed this week's session. I look forward to next week's session. I hope you all have a wonderful weekend and God bless. Take care.